The clock on the far wall had no second hand. It wasn't broken. It was simply built that way, an hour hand, a minute hand, and nothing else. No visible proof of movement. Just the quiet suggestion that time was passing whether you watched it or not. Someone had set a kettle on a small iron stove in the corner. It did not whistle. It only breathed. Soft, contained pressure, a faint tremor in the metal that made the lid quiver now and then like a nervous habit. A thin thread of steam wandered up and disappeared into the dimness near the ceiling. A pencil rolled an inch across the table and stopped at the edge of a folded map. It hadn't been pushed. The table was slightly uneven, or the floor beneath it was. Everything in the room had learned to lean. A man's boot tapped once, then again, then paused as if the sound itself had become too loud to allow. The pause lasted longer than the tapping had. When the boot resumed, it was slower, almost apologetic. On the table, papers stacked in careful piles, their corners aligned with a discipline that belonged more to fear than order. A stamped envelope lay unopened beside a dull tin ashtray. Someone had stubbed out a cigarette there earlier, grinding it down to a smear. The smell lingered anyway. Stale smoke mixed with damp wool and the faint sour bite of cold metal. A radio sat on a shelf, its face dark, not off, just waiting. It had been turned low, nearly silent but not switched away. The wire leading to it ran along the wall and vanished behind a crate that held nothing visible. The radio would speak when spoken to. For now, it kept its mouth closed. A hand moved across the map with 2 fingers, tracing a line that had been traced so many times the paper was worn thin along it. The fingers stopped, lifted, returned, traced again. There was no urgency in the motion, just repetition, like rubbing a worry stone. The map made no argument. It accepted the touch without giving anything back. Somewhere outside the walls, a vehicle idled. The engine note rose and fell gently, as if the driver couldn't decide whether to keep it alive or let it die. The sound traveled through the building like a slow pulse. Every so often it coughed, then steadied again. A door down the hall opened and closed. Not a slam. A careful closure, quiet enough to pretend it hadn't happened. Footsteps followed, measured, heavy, then softened as the person turned away. No voices came with them. Even conversation felt postponed, as though speech might push the room forward. At the edge of the table sat a small metal dish holding a few bent paper clips, a rubber stamp and a spool of twine. Ordinary office objects, the kind that belonged to mundane work. Someone touched the twine once, pressed it with a thumb, and let go. The twine sprang back with the slow stubbornness of something that had been stretched too many times. A man cleared his throat and didn't speak. Another man reached for a cup that had gone cold. He lifted it, took a sip, and didn't react. Not to taste, not to temperature. He set it back down in exactly the same ring of moisture it had left on the table. The ring stayed there, a pale circle that refused to dry. The kettle breathed. The boot tapped. The pencil remained at the edge like it wanted to fall but lacked permission. On the wall near the doorway hung a coat that no one wore. It had been put there in haste and never adjusted. One sleeve drooped lower than the other, as if the coat itself was exhausted. Beneath it, a hook held a cap. The cap's brim cast a small shadow on the wall. The shadow did not move. A scrap of paper lay near the map's corner, covered in numbers written twice, then crossed out, then written again more neatly. The ink was dark where the pen had pressed too hard. Whoever wrote it had tried to make certainty out of pressure. Somebody's watch, real with a second hand, ticked softly under a cuff. It was the only honest thing in the room. Its little hand marched around its circle without emotion, without apology. Tick, tick, tick. The sound was small, but it found every gap. No one looked at the watch. They looked everywhere else. At the map, at the radio, at the closed door, at the kettle, at their own hands. At the paper stacks that promised meaning. At the empty chair pulled slightly away from the table, waiting for someone who had not arrived yet. The air had a particular stillness to it, the kind that settles when people have decided, without saying it, that they are going to keep behaving normally until the last possible second. Every movement was careful. Every object was put down quietly. Even breathing seemed controlled, as though too much breath might disturb whatever fragile balance held the room together. A distant thud came from outside, not near, not immediate. It could have been anything. A crate dropped, a door shut, a vehicle backfiring. No one commented. They listened, then pretended they hadn't. The radio remained dark. The kettle remained patient. The map stayed open, exposed, like a wound that would not be covered. And then, so faint it might have been imagined, another sound threaded through it all. A far-off signal tone, the kind that preceded words, the kind that demanded attention without giving information. A hand moved toward the radio and stopped halfway. The room held its breath, not because something had happened, but because there wasn't much time left for nothing to happen. The man with the watch finally looked at it, and the act felt almost indecent, like lifting a sheet off something you weren't ready to see. He didn't announce the time. He didn't need to. The room changed the instant his eyes dropped, as if everyone could feel the minute hand through him. His thumb brushed the edge of his cuff once, smoothing a crease that wasn't there. Then he let his arm fall back to the table. The kettle had gone quiet. Not because it was empty, but because someone had shifted the damper on the stove a fraction, starving the flame down to a low, controlled glow. In the softer heat, the water stopped threatening to speak. It only waited. Beyond the walls, the idling vehicle cut off at last. The engine note died in stages. One last rise, a reluctant dip, then silence. The absence it left behind was louder than the sound had been. In that new quiet, the building's small noises became obvious. A radiator clicking as it cooled, a paper edge fluttering from the slightest draft, the distant slow scrape of a chair somewhere down the corridor. Someone opened the radio's face panel and turned the dial a millimeter. Not enough to bring the voice up, just enough to confirm it was there, breathing under the static like a sleeper you didn't want to wake. No one spoke. Not out of discipline, but because language would force the situation into shape, and they were still trying to keep it formless. The door to the room opened without warning. A figure stepped in, paused in the threshold as if checking whether the air itself had changed, then shut the door behind him in that careful way, quiet enough to pretend there had been no interruption. He didn't remove his cap. He didn't hang his coat. He stood with his shoulders slightly forward like a man who expected the ceiling to lower. He carried a folder under one arm, but it wasn't the folder that held attention. It was his face, washed pale from cold, eyes irritated as though he'd been outside in wind or smoke or both. He glanced at the map and then away, as if he'd already seen it too many times. He took 2 steps toward the table and stopped at the empty chair, the one that had been waiting. His fingers found the chair back and gripped it, not sitting yet, just holding it steady. In the corridor beyond the door, other movement drifted past. Boots, the muted jingle of equipment, a clipped murmur that ended before it became words. The building was not empty. It was merely restrained. The new man set his folder down. Paper on wood made a sound that traveled further than it should have. Someone reached instinctively for a pencil, caught themselves, then took the pencil anyway and held it without writing. The gesture felt like superstition. If they were ready to record, perhaps nothing would need recording. The man with the folder cleared his throat. This time he spoke, but only a few syllables, and even those were shaped to avoid meaning. They're still on schedule. The words were plain. Too plain. Like saying the weather was holding when a storm was visible over the horizon. A second man, older, shifted his weight and stared at the map without moving his eyes. "What schedule?" he asked, and the question wasn't confusion. It was defiance, a demand that someone name the thing they had all been circling. The folder man hesitated, just a breath long, and then answered with a phrase that sounded practiced. "The timetable. Not a date, not a plan, not an order. A timetable. Something official enough to hide behind. Something you could point to instead of thinking." The watch ticked under the cuff again. Tick, tick, tick. At the far end of the table, someone poured the kettle water into cups as if hospitality could keep the world in place. The steam rose thinly, almost embarrassed. A cup was nudged toward the folder man. He didn't take it. Outside, the airfield or the depot or the yard, whatever lay beyond the walls, seemed to inhale. The kind of inhale that came before coordinated motion. The kind that came before engines started, and men were told where to stand. A telephone rang once, sharply, and then stopped. One ring only. Not a missed call. A signal. The man nearest the phone didn't reach for it immediately, as though answering might begin something he wasn't finished postponing. He picked up the receiver on the third heartbeat after the ring ended. He listened. His face stayed blank, but his fingers tightened around the phone's base until the knuckles went pale. When he spoke, his voice was low, neutral, almost bored, like a clerk discussing inventory. "Yes," he said. "Understood." He hung up slowly, placing the receiver down as though a sudden movement might break it. No one asked what the call was. No one needed to. They could read it in the way his eyes didn't meet theirs, in the way he sat back as if the chair had grown heavier. The older man finally leaned in. "Any delays?" he asked. A smaller man, quiet until now, gave a short sound that might have been a laugh in another life. It wasn't humor. It was disbelief. "There are always delays," he said, and for a second his voice held irritation. At the weather, at the roads, at paperwork, at everything that could be blamed. Then he softened, as if remembering where he was. "But nothing that changes it. The radio crackled, just a brief pop of static, and then went silent again. The sound made everyone's spine tighten, even though no message followed. Their bodies reacted before their minds could. The folder man opened his folder at last. Inside were sheets with stamps and signatures, margins crowded with handwritten notes. A small photograph paperclipped to the top page showed a stretch of landscape, flat, pale, almost empty. It could have been anywhere, and that was the point. Ordinary ground, ordinary distance, ordinary emptiness that would soon no longer be ordinary. He slid the top sheet forward. No one touched it. They stared at it the way men stare at a wound they know will be blamed on them later, whether or not they caused it. From down the corridor, a voice called a name, muffled, urgent, but controlled, the kind of urgency that pretended to be routine. The man with the watch stood up, not abruptly, carefully. He straightened his jacket, tugged it into place, aligning himself like the paper stacks had been aligned. "What's the weather doing?" someone asked, as if the sky might still offer mercy. The answer came immediately, too quickly, as if rehearsed. Holding, like a breath, like a lid, like the last thin barrier between normal and not. The cup of hot water sat untouched, steam fading. The map remained open. The timetable remained intact. And outside the building, somewhere not far enough away, the first engine turned over. One cough, then a steady rumble, and the room pretended for one more minute that it was only another day in the office. The minute hand on the wall clock moved, invisibly, toward a line no one was willing to name. Morning asserted itself without ceremony. Not light, there had already been light for hours, but activity, the kind that arrives not with urgency, but with momentum. Doors opened and closed along the corridor with renewed frequency. Boots passed in pairs now, not singles. A clipboard appeared where there hadn't been one before, tucked under an arm, pages already smudged with fingerprints. The kettle was emptied and refilled. Someone rinsed the cups without being asked. Another straightened the chair that had never been sat in properly. These gestures had no strategic value, but they were done anyway, as if maintaining order on the surface might keep disorder from rising beneath it. The map was folded and unfolded again, the crease never quite lining up the same way twice. Each time it was opened, fingers hesitated over a certain section, hovered, then moved on as though the paper itself carried heat. Outside, engines multiplied, not roaring, not accelerating, just present. A layered hum that pressed gently against the walls, steady enough to fade into the background if you let it. Men learned to let it. They always did. A runner arrived with a message written in pencil. The graphite was light, the pressure uneven. Whoever had written it hadn't wanted to commit fully to the words. The runner handed it off, waited for a nod, and left without asking whether the message had been understood. It had been understood. No one spoke about it. A man near the window adjusted the curtain by an inch. The movement revealed nothing new, just more of the same gray sky, low and undecided. But the act itself felt important. He stood there longer than necessary, eyes fixed outward, as if expecting the view to contradict what he already knew. Someone coughed and apologized. The apology was waved away, but the sound lingered, a reminder that bodies were present, that lungs filled and emptied, that blood still moved at a normal pace. The radio murmured now, not speech, not yet, just a faint bed of static punctuated by brief tones. Test signals. Checks. The voice behind the signal had not committed to words. It was clearing its throat. A junior officer entered the room carrying a tray with more documents than he could comfortably balance. One corner slid off and had to be caught against his chest. He froze, waiting for reprimand. None came. He placed the tray down carefully, then too carefully, as though the papers might react if startled. He lingered a second longer than protocol required, then left, shoulders tight, relieved to be gone. Among the documents was a sheet with a column of figures that didn't align cleanly. Someone noticed. A finger tapped once beside the discrepancy. "That's been like that," another voice said quietly. "How long?" A pause. Just enough to be uncomfortable. "Since yesterday." Yesterday. A word with weight now. Yesterday was already drifting away, becoming something that could no longer be adjusted. The finger withdrew. No correction was made. In another room, close enough to feel but not to see, metal scraped against metal. A crate being shifted. A latch checked. Someone laughed briefly at something unrelated. The laugh cut off mid-breath, as if the person had suddenly remembered where they were. A phone rang twice this time. The man who answered listened longer than before. When he spoke, he repeated several phrases back, each one neutral, each one designed to confirm without committing. "Yes. Copy that. Understood." When he hung up, he didn't sit down. He remained standing, hands resting on the table's edge, leaning forward slightly, his gaze fixed on nothing in particular. "They're ahead," he said finally. "Ahead of what?" someone asked. He shrugged, a small movement. "Ahead of themselves." That earned a thin smile from one corner of the room. It didn't last. Someone pointed out a change in the wind. It had shifted just enough to matter or just enough to talk about. The remark was framed casually, as an observation, not a concern. The response came just as casually. "It'll settle." Another irregularity surfaced. A delay in a secondary unit, nothing critical, nothing central. The explanation was reasonable. Traffic, a mechanical check, a miscommunication that had already been resolved. Each explanation stacked neatly atop the last, forming a structure that looked like confidence from a distance. The watch ticked. The second hand crossed 12 again and again, unnoticed but relentless. It marked every ignored detail, every dismissed anomaly, every moment where someone could have said more and chose not to. A man thumbed the edge of his notebook and closed it without writing anything. The notebook had remained mostly blank all morning. Its emptiness felt intentional now. Outside, one engine cut off, then another. Not failure, just staging. A rhythm. Stop. Start. Pause. The radio crackled again, longer this time, a voice almost breaking through before retreating. A call sign was spoken, answered, confirmed. Still no message. The room breathed. Someone mentioned lunch, half joking, half serious. The comment landed awkwardly, then found footing as a few men nodded. Food meant continuity. Food meant the day was still behaving like a day. "We'll eat after," someone said. After what, no one specified. A door opened abruptly somewhere nearby, followed by raised voices, brief, controlled, professional. A disagreement, quickly flattened. The sound of authority asserting itself just enough to keep everything aligned. Back in the room, the map was consulted once more. A ruler was laid across it, then removed. The ruler left a faint indentation in the paper, a line that would remain even after it was gone. A man traced that indentation with his nail and then stopped, as if realizing what he was doing. "It's fine," someone said, though no one had asked. Another phone call came through, this one shorter, fewer words. When it ended, the receiver was placed down harder than necessary. No comment followed. The air felt thicker now, not oppressive, not urgent, but loaded. Like weather before rain. Like a held breath shared by too many people at once. A runner passed the open doorway and didn't stop. His pace was faster than before. Someone checked the time again. This time, the watch was consulted openly. Still, no announcement. Still, no correction. Still, no one said the word that hovered just beyond every sentence. Outside, the engines resumed. More of them now, their collective sound smoothing into something continuous. The ground vibrated faintly, not enough to be alarming, just enough to be felt through the soles of boots. Normality continued, but it was thinner now, stretched, transparent in places. The signs were there, misaligned figures, altered wind, compressed schedules, voices that hesitated before answering. They were all seen, they were all acknowledged, and one by one they were folded neatly into the day, filed away under explanations that kept everything moving forward. Because stopping would have required naming what was coming, and no one was ready to do that yet. The window for interruption was still open. Narrow, yes, but open. Like a door left ajar in a quiet house, easy to miss unless you were looking for it. Inside the room, time no longer stretched. It layered, moments stacked on top of each other without fully settling, each one pressing lightly on the next. The effect was subtle but unmistakable. Decisions were being made faster, even when no one admitted to making them. A sheet was removed from the tray and replaced with another. No announcement accompanied the swap. The first sheet slid into a folder and disappeared, as if it had never existed. The second lay flat, cleaner, more confident. It told a simpler story. Someone noticed the change and frowned. Not deeply, not long, just enough to register discomfort. He opened his mouth, closed it again, and instead reached for the pencil. The pencil made a short note in the margin. A question mark. Small, easily ignored. A voice came through the radio at last. Not a command, not an alert, just confirmation. A sequence of numbers read aloud with practiced calm, followed by a pause that suggested expectation. The reply was immediate. Too immediate. The kind of response that comes from rehearsal, not thought. Confirmed. The radio went quiet again, satisfied. A chair scraped softly as someone shifted position. The sound felt louder now, intrusive, like a cough in a church. Several heads turned instinctively toward it, then away, embarrassed by the reaction. The man at the phone received another call. He listened, nodded once, and said nothing before hanging up. When he turned back to the table, his expression carried a new stillness. Not tension, but resolve. The kind that forms when alternatives begin to evaporate. "There's a gap," he said. It was the first time anyone had used a word that suggested opportunity. "How long?" someone asked. He checked his watch. This time, everyone watched him do it. "Minutes," he said. The room absorbed the word carefully. Minutes were manageable, minutes could be filled, minutes could be waited out. "Is it enough?" another voice asked. The man didn't answer right away. He looked at the map, at the ruler's faint indentation, at the pencil mark in the margin. "It would require adjustment," he said finally. Adjustment, not cancellation, not reversal, just a change in angle, timing, emphasis. The kind of thing that could be justified later as prudence, or criticized as hesitation. A silence followed, heavier than the others. Someone cleared their throat. "Adjustment introduces risk. So does not adjusting," came the reply. The exchange hovered in the air, unresolved. It had the shape of a crossroads, even if no signpost marked it. Outside, a signal horn sounded once. Short, restrained. Not an alarm. A reminder. Somewhere, men were moving into position based on assumptions that had already calcified. A junior officer appeared at the doorway, hesitated, then spoke. "They're asking whether to proceed." Proceed where? No one clarified. The man with the watch closed his eyes briefly. Not in exhaustion, but in calculation. When he opened them, he looked older. "Tell them to stand by," he said. The officer nodded and vanished. Stand by, a phrase that preserved the illusion of choice. A pause that could be mistaken for control. The man who had made the pencil mark leaned forward. "If we're going to adjust," he said carefully, "it needs to be now." Now. The word landed hard. Several faces turned toward the older man at the end of the table. He had not spoken much, but his presence carried weight. He stared at the map, unmoving, as if waiting for it to change its mind. He lifted his head slowly. "What's your confidence?" he asked. The question was addressed to no one and everyone at once. The answer came fragmented. Percentages that didn't align. Conditions that were mostly favorable. Unknowns that were probably negligible. Each phrase softened the last, sanding down the edges until the risk sounded abstract. The older man listened, nodded once and said nothing. Another horn sounded outside, 2 short blasts this time. The engines responded, rising slightly in pitch, eager, obedient. The radio crackled again. A voice asked for confirmation. Not yet, but soon. The man at the phone glanced toward the older man again, then back at the radio. His hand hovered over the switch, not touching it, not pulling away. The gap was closing. Someone pointed out that altering course now would ripple outward. Delays, confusion, explanations. It wouldn't stay contained, he said. Contained. Another word that pretended control was still absolute. The pencil mark remained in the margin, small and lonely. The older man exhaled slowly. We proceed, he said, not loudly, not formally, just enough to be heard. No objection followed. Not because there wasn't time, but because the moment for objection had passed so quietly that no one could say exactly when it had gone. The radio was turned up a fraction. The officer returned, awaiting instruction. The man with the watch nodded once. Proceed, he said. Outside, the engines surged, not into motion yet, but into readiness. The sound thickened, filled the space between walls and ribs. The door was closed. The window was shut. The gap, small, fragile, sealed itself without ceremony. And in that sealing, something essential slipped away, unnoticed, leaving behind only the forward pull of what had already begun. The shift was subtle enough to be missed if you weren't looking for it. A paper slid into place. A stamp was pressed down once, firm, efficient, and lifted. Ink dried almost immediately, as if it had been waiting. The sound of the stamp was dull, final, and far too small for what it represented. No one acknowledged it. The man who had stamped the paper aligned it with the others, tapped the stack twice against the table to square the edges and set it aside. The motion was practiced. He had done it hundreds of times before. That familiarity made it more dangerous than any raised voice could have been. The radio carried a new tone now. Not louder, not urgent, just continuous. A sustained presence that replaced silence without asking permission. Voices moved through it in clipped exchanges, each one confirming the last, each one narrowing the space for doubt. Outside, the engines stopped idling. They did not accelerate yet. They simply changed posture, no longer waiting, no longer restless. Ready. Someone reached for the window latch out of habit, checked that it was secure, and let their hand rest there for a moment longer than necessary. The glass vibrated faintly, responding to distant motion. The vibration was steady, controlled. The man with the watch adjusted the strap on his wrist, then adjusted it again, though it was already tight. The second hand continued its indifferent march. He watched it now, openly. There was no point pretending anymore. A runner appeared at the door, breath shallow but composed. "They're in position," he said. "In all sectors?" came the reply. The runner hesitated, just a fraction. Yes. The hesitation went unchallenged. A folder was closed. Another was opened. The order of things had been finalized, even if no one had said so aloud. Pages that might have mattered earlier were now buried beneath newer ones, cleaner ones, more decisive ones. The pencil with the question mark rolled slightly, nudged by the movement of the table. It came to rest against the edge of the map, its mark half covered by the fold. The question did not disappear. It was simply obscured. The older man stood up. The act carried weight, not authority, not command, but gravity. Chairs shifted instinctively, space being made for him without instruction. He did not look at the map this time. He did not look at the radio. He looked at the door. "Make sure communications stay open," he said. "Yes, sir." "And keep the line clear." "Yes, sir." The phrasing mattered. Stay open, clear. Words that implied flow, continuity, inevitability. The radio responded almost immediately, as if it had been listening. A voice requested confirmation once more. This time, the reply did not pause. "Confirmed." The word landed and stayed. No cheer followed, no visible reaction. Just a collective stillness, like a room settling after furniture has been moved. Outside, a signal flag was raised. No one inside saw it, but they felt the consequence. Somewhere, a hand mirrored another hand. Somewhere, a process advanced one step further than it had before. A man reached for his coat at last, shrugged into it and adjusted the collar. He did not leave the room. The coat was not for warmth. It was for readiness. The kettle, forgotten on the stove, emitted a brief, sharp hiss as water touched metal too hot to hold it. Someone turned the flame off quickly. The sound cut short, leaving behind a faint smell of scorched iron. Too late to matter. The radio's tone changed again, barely perceptible but enough to draw every eye toward it. A sequence began. Numbers, acknowledgments, repetitions. Each exchange tightened the thread. The man with the watch stopped adjusting it. He folded his hands. A clerk entered quietly, carrying a ledger. He placed it on the table, opened it to a marked page, and stood back. The page was blank except for a single line waiting to be filled. The pen hovered. No one said anything. The pen touched paper. Ink flowed. It was not dramatic, it was not rushed, it was simply done. The ledger was closed. Somewhere outside, a barrier was lifted. Somewhere else, a path was cleared that would not be blocked again. Inside the room, no one spoke. There was nothing left to negotiate, nothing left to delay. The machinery of decision, slow, careful, human, had completed its final quiet turn. What followed would not need permission. It was already moving. Silence returned. Not the fragile kind from earlier. Not the silence that waited to be filled, but a deeper one. Settled. Intentional. The kind that arrives after all useful words have been used up. The radio remained on, but no one listened to it now. It spoke to itself. Voices moving through channels that no longer required attention from this room. Whatever needed confirming had already been confirmed. Whatever needed hearing had already been heard. A man leaned against the wall near the door and closed his eyes, not to rest, but to steady himself. His breathing slowed. He counted it, perhaps without realizing. In, out, a private ritual against the weight pressing inward. The map stayed folded. No one reopened it. Outside, the engines did not change pitch. They did not surge. They held their tone, balanced, restrained, patient. The sound became part of the structure of the place, like the walls themselves. It was no longer a signal. It was an environment. Someone checked the radio volume and turned it down slightly. The gesture was gentle, almost respectful, as if lowering a voice in a room where someone had fallen asleep. The ledger sat where it had been placed. Closed. Complete. A finished object now, no longer awaiting contribution. Its presence felt heavier than when it had been open, like a door that had just been locked from the inside. A chair creaked softly as someone shifted their weight. The sound carried farther than expected. The man froze, embarrassed by the noise, then slowly settled again, choosing stillness over comfort. The watch ticked. Each second arrived cleanly, precisely, without emotion. The sound no longer irritated anyone. It simply existed, marking time that no longer felt negotiable. Outside the window, the sky had flattened into a uniform gray. No movement. No definition. The light was even, unchanging, as if the day itself had decided not to interfere. A telephone rang once. No one reached for it. The ringing stopped. Footsteps passed in the corridor, then faded. Orders were moving elsewhere now, carried by people who would not question them. People who would act because acting was their role, not because they understood the shape of what was unfolding. Inside the room, the men remained. Some stood. Some sat. No one left. No one spoke. They were no longer waiting for a decision. They were waiting for time to catch up. The radio emitted a low, steady tone again, longer this time. Not an alarm, not a warning. A marker. A boundary crossed somewhere beyond the walls. A man glanced at the clock on the wall, the one without a second hand. For the first time, its design felt cruel. The minute hand had moved, but he could not say when. He could not say how much remained. He looked away. The air felt different now. Not heavier, not warmer, but final, as if the room itself understood that its role was complete. Outside, a distant sound echoed across the ground. Not loud, not sudden. A controlled release of motion. Something beginning exactly when it was meant to begin. Inside, no one reacted. The moment for reaction had already passed. A hand rested on the table, fingers splayed, feeling the grain of the wood. The texture was familiar, real, grounding. The man kept his hand there, anchoring himself to something solid. Another man adjusted his coat collar again, then stopped halfway. Realizing the movement served no purpose, he let his hands fall to his sides. Breathing slowed across the room, unconsciously synchronized. A shared pause, a collective holding. The radio went quiet. Not switched off, just silent. The engines outside maintained their steady presence, no longer background, no longer signal. Simply the sound of something in motion, beyond recall. Time did not accelerate. It did not rush. It narrowed. In that narrowing, there was no space left for reconsideration, no room for interruption, no gap to slip through. Only the thin, exact line between now and what comes next. No one spoke. No one moved. And for one suspended instant, balanced perfectly between decision and consequence, the world seemed to stop advancing, holding its breath just long enough for the silence to settle completely. Then the silence held, and time waited no longer.